Okay, so hi, I'm Jessica Pettit. I'm going to be your facilitator of a three-part, what I like to call safe zone, and I'm using air quotes on purpose, safe zone training, and we're going to be doing the first piece today, which is specifically on language. I'm going to invite everyone for this particular program to bring pen and paper to the activity. If you are watching the recording, I mean you too, you're going to need pen and paper, I promise. What I have done, and I was explaining this just a second ago before I hit record, but throughout my professional career, I have probably observed, I don't know, 2,000 different safe zone, I'm using air quotes again, curriculum. And what is fascinating about the Safe Zone program is that it often does two things really badly. So the first one is reduces an entire community that you may or may not even be a part of down to like super tiny little bits that then you're like, oh, as long as I know this, I'll be fine. Which is about distancing your own sense of responsibility from being reflective of who you are and how you are in relationship with other people, and more importantly, how are those other people. So I am not a big fan of that. We will not be doing that. The other thing is smushing it all, that's the technical term, smushing it all, into this teeny tiny little 60-minute program that usually comes with a cute little handout. And in that 60 minutes, that's all you need to know. So then what ends up happening is we end up talking primarily about white, educated, upper class, able-bodied, US-based gay and lesbian people for the like general understanding of the heterosexual or heteronormative cisgender community. I don't like doing that either. So I have created this particular curriculum to include all of us. Me, you, your friends, your neighbors, that guy you don't like talking to on social media. All of us have some physical body. We have some sense of identity related to a sense of sexuality or gender. We have some relationship with other people, even if it's a stranger in the grocery store, or a more physical or emotional or spiritual relationship with somebody else. So if this is a common denominator of humanity, and it's a webinar, so we need to be able to figure out how to smunch it down into teeny little bits that's a little bit more consumable. What I've done is created a three-part curriculum. Today is part one. We're going to be talking about sticks and stones, LGBTQA 101. We'll be talking about why I use those letters, what this means, language, etc. But in order to do what I want to do at the end of the third program, we have to be able to start with where we are at. So today's program specifically is about where you are at. Now, I've already made people nervous because this is a webinar kind of thing, and you're like, what do you mean where I'm at? I'm not talking, I'm muted. I get it. You are going to have a raucous conversation with yourself to determine where you are at, because you know where you are good and you know where you are not good, and the best part is this gaping hole in between the two of those, which is stuff that you haven't really thought about. So as you're watching the recording or as you're participating today, I highly recommend you are welcome to send me a text message anytime you like about anything, now, later, in the future, whatever, as long as Sprint is a company, I have a cell phone. But my text number is 202-670-4262. 202-670-4262. I put my Twitter handle up here because kids these days really like to do the Twitter. I barely know how to log into Twitter, so I would send me a text. But I am a Breakfast Club Gen Xer, so let's stick with texting. Some people really need to know what the learning objectives are if you're getting any kind of like educational credit or something. So as we are breaking down this larger conversation I want to have into this one particular hour, today, and only today, what we're going to be focusing on is the language that is already floating inside of your head. Not the language that is floating around in somebody else in this Brady Bunch screen's head, but the language you know. What you've heard, what you've used, what has been used at you, what has been used around you, what you've seen in media. All of those answers are correct. And what is fascinating, spoiler alert, they follow a pattern. And if we don't actually debunk or at least decolonize that pattern, we can't have a deeper conversation. So that's why we start here. I always like to say that this is starting at kind of a U.S. lens. One is I live in the United States. Most of my lived experience is in the United States. But the few times that I have done consulting work or trainings in a few other countries, what I have noticed is that the U.S. stereotypes around sexuality or gender are pervasive enough due to MTV and television that this U.S. lens can be at least centered or in comparison to other countries, but we are probably going to primarily be focusing on a U.S. lens. And then, what does this have to do with you? So it may not even be you as an individual, but you working with other people, what it means inside of a work context where most of the words we're going to be using over the next 3 workshops, you're not even supposed to say in a staff meeting. And you also need to say these things in a staff meeting because they involve people that you work with, they involve your clients, they involve you and who and how you're making choices on how to show up. So that's the big plan. I already said you're going to need paper. Some of you are stubborn and just still haven't gotten it. That's fine. But if you're watching the recording, it's also flexible enough that there's multiple ways of participating in this activity. Due to sheltering in place, y'all are probably doing the one-on-one route right now, which is totally fine. But if you had a small group, like at a staff meeting or something, and you were to watch the recording again, you can use 5 sheets of paper and pass them around the table. If I ever get to go on an airplane again and I were to come, I would have 5 giant pieces of flip chart paper around the room and we would rotate around. So we're going to take some assumptions that you're probably doing this on your own, which is totally fine. You need 1 sheet of paper then. So again, I usually have to emphasize this part. Grab a piece of paper, pick your style, etc. For those of you that are watching live, feel free to hold up your pens and paper and make me proud, little mama. Because look, you're following directions. Okay, good job. So what you're going to do is you're going to take this sheet of paper and you're going to divide it into 5 columns. You do not need a ruler or anything like that to make sure that this is perfect, but you're just going to do 5 different columns. We're going to pay attention to each one of these columns individually, which is really one of an important focus because usually the language that we're talking about is all smunched together. So we're actually going to pay attention to 5 different elements on purpose, one at a time. This is, again, just more directions if you were passing it around a table or going around the room. So you may not, if you're doing this in a group, you may not get to all 5. If you're doing it by yourself, you get to manage your own time. You're probably going to get to all 5. So 5 columns, a piece of paper, let's do it. So the top of each column, you're going to label them heterosexual, lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender. I would prefer in that order because it makes the directions easier later. Now, while you are labeling your columns, I can already tell some people are going to be like, why is it these words and not other words? And why is it this word? I learned a new word. I have a cable package. Yes, that is very true. So we are sticking with these 5 words on purpose because these are the 5 words that often tend to come up in the U.S. when we are talking about anything that is straight people or not straight people. Notice the binary there. So we're just going to keep to these 5. If you are all super advanced place, you are welcome to show off on your own paper later because nobody needs to hear how smart you are. That's what you're not paying me for. So 5 columns, top at the top, heterosexual or straight, lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender. Now, what is interesting is I'm about to do something that you are going to find very hard and probably very frustrating. It involves 60 seconds of me being relatively silent and you having a raucous conversation. So what we are going to do is we are going to rotate, air quotes, around your 5 columns. But I'm going to give you 1 minute per column. And what I want you to do is to write down, not yet, but write down anything and everything that comes to mind regarding the word at the top of the column. It doesn't mean you're this person. It just means whatever comes to mind. Good, bad, ugly, awesome, famous people, locations, house plants, I don't care. Whatever comes to mind. There's no value judgment. But you need to record the language that you use or that you're familiar with so you then can have a conversation about the patterns that are in those words. I call this activity sticks and stones on purpose because it's one of our earliest lies to children, right? Is that sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. Well, that's job security for all of us, right? Because, of course, words are really painful. And so if we can't take responsibility for the words that we're familiar with, then how can we ever heal from any harm any words have ever done? So with that, you're going to spend a minute for each column. Do not jump around. You're going to spend 1 minute for each column. I have a timer, so you triple Virgos out there, don't worry, you're in very good hands. I have a timer. But anything and everything that comes to mind, and you're not going to have to share with anybody else what comes to mind. And more importantly, you don't even have to spell it correctly. You just need to do like a brain dump for each of the columns. So don't jump around. Any content, good, bad, ugly, awesome, doesn't matter. So first off, we're going to start with heterosexual. Oddly, when doing an LGBT ally training, we almost never start with straight people, but that's a funny thing to me. So 51 seconds, do a brain dump in your column. About 10 seconds left. Okay, so that was about a minute with heterosexual or straight people. For some of you, that is the longest you've spent. It's okay. We're going to move along though. So next minute is gay. So whatever comes to mind, doesn't matter. Umbrella group, individual, don't matter. You're going to get about a minute and just stay in the gay column. Do not go AWOL on me. Just on the gay column, anything that comes to mind, you're going to do a brain dump in the next minute. Okay, here you go. About 30 seconds left. Okay, that was your minute for gay. Next up is going to be lesbian. Same thing. Good, bad, ugly, awesome, famous people, house plants, whatever, doesn't matter. Anything that comes to mind that's floating around in your head when you see the word lesbian, put it in this column. You'll have about a minute. Don't jump around. About 20 seconds left. Okay, so that was your minute with lesbian. You got 2 more to go. You're doing great. So next up is bisexual. Anything and everything that comes to mind, you're going to do a brain dump into that column. There are no wrong answers. You're not going to share them with anybody. What are you going to do? Fax your sheet of paper to somebody? So anything that comes to mind, knock yourself out. You get a minute. A little less than 30 seconds. Okay, one more to go. This one is 1 minute solid with the word transgender at the top. Again, a reminder, do not hop around to different lists. Don't be adding things. You don't have to alphabetize anything. It's fine. Do a brain dump in the next minute of anything that comes to mind when you see the word transgender at the top of a column on your sheet of paper. Here you go. $30 seconds. Okay, you should be relatively coming to a close. You can shake it off or do whatever you need to do. Sounds great. Thank you very much for playing along with my game. Now, what is fascinating to me, if I do this in groups, what I typically do is I have everyone who's walking around the room take the same color marker with them. So then we can ask for clarifications or definitions or something when you see something that's on the list. But people really want to compare all the lists together. And that's part of the problem, I think, with a lot of, quote, safe zone programs, is that we look at everything together as if it's one giant thing, instead of looking at who's even left out of the stereotypes that we actually are pulling out of these different groups. So again, I am a trained professional, so we're going to go through each group one at a time, and I don't want you to get comparo, which means I don't want you to look at one column and then look at the other columns. I just want you to pay attention to the patterns that exist in the stereotypes of each column all by itself. And then, again, spoiler alert, we'll get all advanced class and do comparo later. What I find incredible is when I switch from doing this in person to being online, where there's less opportunity to look for clarification or ask for definitions about the words you wrote on your list. What I eventually found is that the words you wrote on your list still follow as if we were in a group. There's some outliers or new language or something that may exist, but even the outliers and the new language actually follow a pattern as well. So where I can't see yours, what I am going to be able to do is show you those patterns, more than likely. So we're going to start with heterosexual. I already said that I think it's really strange that heterosexual almost never is part of this conversation, which seems so ironic to me, being as though most ally programs are about making straight people not be jerks. What is fun is being a jerk is actually not required for sexual identity, and gay, lesbian, bisexual, and trans people can also be jerks. It is true. They don't like to talk about that. We like to just blame straight people for that stuff, but it's true. So what is this jerk? What is the assumption of privilege? What is the assumption of dominance? How does this show up? We can't have that conversation until we actually understand what our general assumptions and stereotypes are of each group in itself. So if we look at straight, that usually the only negative comment that will show up on the straight list when we're in person is the word breeder. And that's also, as a facilitator, a good tip of like, there are some queer people in this room. So straight people are like, what is a breeder? Because you're not actually entitled to knowledge of all of the slang terms. That's a little awakening. But breeder usually is about straight people having children, which is also problematic because gay and lesbian, bisexual, and trans people can also have children, and some straight people don't have children. But we don't like facts. We like stereotypes. So breeder may be there, but generally speaking, what I want you to do is just look at your list. So I don't know, notice I did not do any introductions. I don't know who any of y'all are. I'm assuming y'all know who you are because that would be really awkward if you didn't. Maybe one of you is Ali Sheedy and you've Zoom bombed me, and this may or may not be what you were expecting. But generally speaking, if you look at your list for heterosexual, the terms that often show up is heterosexual or straight. Marriage gets talked about, Christianity. If religion is mentioned, you mean Christian. And then depending on where you are in the country, depends whether or not you meant Catholic or Protestant. Interesting. If you got political, you meant Republican, although rumor has it there are straight Democrats and straight Green Party people. There are also straight people who don't care about politics. But generally speaking, if on that list it's going to show up as Republican. What does it mean to be normal or boring or vanilla? What is wrong with vanilla? Accepted, allies. Sometimes we're like, oh, let's put in some good terms in case she's looking at my list, right? Like an ally or an advocate, which is about like doing nice things for other people from your little posh front porch, right? That's basically what that means. And then we can get into the negative terms, right? Of like hater or homophobic or super privileged or closed-minded. That's, we all need therapy. Got it. Okay. So that is usually what happens in the heterosexual list. What is fascinating to me, though, just looking at your heterosexual list, and if you're jumping around, feel free to fold your page so that you're only looking at one list. But what is fascinating is that no matter who you are, unless you have a lived experience or your own identities that you put out on the list, if we look at the stereotypes that show up, the heterosexual list is almost always white. If not white, it is at least white in comparison, or compared to white-centered. It's usually middle to upper class. They're cisgender men and women who are married or want to be married. They have children or they want to be having children. They live in a home with a picket fence. Then you get in some division between team dog and team cat. That gets cleared up in lesbian. And of course, they all have a job. They're usually in their 30s. They speak English. They usually go to some kind of Christian-based church. Again, do I mean Catholic or Protestant is dependent on where I am in the country. And rarely are there like Jeff. Rarely is there a specific name of a straight person. If you're going to pick like a straight television show like which CSI, there's just so many. So you don't typically list very specific things. So that is very often what shows up in the heterosexual list. Okay, great. Now we at least know where we're starting to be able to have a safe zone conversation. So what is fascinating to have a safe zone conversation is we need to shift from golden rule to the platinum rule. So golden rule, some of you may be familiar with, this is usually when we all start sounding like pirates, but it's like treating other people unto which you wish to be treated. Which basically means my favorite pizza topping is green olives. And so I brought you a pizza and it's covered in green olives. Hope you like it. That's basically what the golden rule is, right? Is that I'm going to treat you the way I want to be treated. Green olives is my favorite. Green olives should be in every pizza restaurant, but they're not, which is why there's special little golden tokens in my world. I have been informed that there are weird people exist who don't like green olives on their pizza. I don't know how they live. That is the golden rule, but we often call that being an ally of like, well, it's my favorite. What's your problem? Well, that's not actually an open door to having some kind of ally or advocate conversation. A platinum rule, the shift there, and Tony Alessandra's work is the one who created the platinum rule. But what that is like, hey, Maggie, do you like pizza? I'm thinking about having pizza. Maybe you don't even want pizza. Maybe you brought your own lunch. Would you like to have lunch together? And then shut up and listen to what Maggie wants to do about lunch. That's the platinum rule, is to treat people the way they want to be treated, not making the assumption that you're right. So if we flip into the platinum rule, we can then have a conversation that uses language or pronouns or descriptors of how they are describing themselves and their family. So going back to your heterosexual list, married with kids, like that also doesn't always take into consideration like stepchildren or different roles people are having in the family. Maybe there's more than one partner in the family. Maybe they're non-monogamous or polyamorous, which has been a very fun output of this Zooming from sheltering in place, is the private lives that are now becoming available because people make you turn your video on, which, by the way, you do not have to have your video on for me. It's funner for me because of movement, but you don't have to. But if we're not thinking about the platinum rule, we cannot even begin to have a conversation about what a safer zone is. But we can't actually really understand the difference until we can articulate what language is floating around in our heads. So if that is an assumption of what is heterosexual or straight, what I want to do now is I want to move to the gay list. So you, because you're a smart person, are going to want to get all comparo, but don't. Just look at the gay list by itself. If you need to fold your paper, fold your paper. But if you look at your gay list, regardless of who you are or how you identify, two things kind of happen. First is gay often is an umbrella term for everything not straight. Because we like a nice little binary, like a softball team, right? There's the straight people and the gay people. I use the word queer as that umbrella term, and in some places that is like not at all acceptable because it's still seen as a really negative word, which is why we should all go out for pizza with green olives and talk about language. Now I'm getting hungry. If you didn't do it as an umbrella term, you may have done it as an identity, and that identity is, lo and behold, also 30-year-old English-speaking white men who may or may not have some kind of economic means. They often have jobs that are usually considered feminine, right? Like stylists or fashionistas or something. With Will and Grace coming back on TV, it's not as funny anymore, but when Will and Grace wasn't on TV, Jack would always show up on this list. Jack's not even a title character. But like all good sitcoms, I'm about to ruin television for you, all the edgy characters are always the neighbors or something like that. So if I ask who's the gay character on Will and Grace, rarely does Will show up on this list. Jack, who somehow is employed, which I don't understand, and is very feminine and is promiscuous, all of those kind of things will show up. If we're actually talking about sex on Will and Grace, Karen is the most sexual character. Not also a title character, but that's not who's going to show up on this list or this like social media reference. What is also interesting is specific sex acts will show up here. Sexually transmitted infections, HIV or AIDS, something like that will typically show up. Rarely do people of color show up. Even if you used it as an umbrella term, you rarely talked about women people. We also don't talk about any kind of diversity around economics or race or language or religion or politics or any of that kind of stuff. Nope. We just stick straight to our little stereotypes, which can be really limiting because it doesn't actually involve that person. It involves what we think about that person, which is not the platinum rule. So that is usually what is on the gay list and how it is limiting. This is also important to mention that this is not just straight people limiting gay people. This is also gay people limiting gay people. So I used to work in LGBT centers on college campuses, and one of the very common problems I had to deal with would be men who identified as gay but didn't fit into the stereotype. So then we got into disordered eating and drug use and things like this because they were trying to be this very feminine, hairless, white, rich man who was actually on financial aid trying to get through college, identified as a person of color, and didn't actually fit a size 0 kind of pant. So if the stereotypes exist. It's not just the dominant group that keeps the stereotypes in place. We often affirm or squeeze ourselves into too small a pants to try to fit into that stereotype, that then also affirm this kind of binary of like straight people get to do everything. Although if you want to get comparo going backwards, you didn't really mention straight women. We just kind of default to men. So now we're at gay, where we're still kind of only talking about men, even if we said it was an umbrella term. This is what we mean when we often talk about like the patriarchy or something like this, is that we tend to default to this man thing. Also, the white imagination is we tend to default to these men being white. That's not necessarily true, and of course it can also be true. But until we understand the language, we can't move forward with a bigger conversation about what it means to be an ally. So, next up, lesbiterian. Lesbiterian is not an actual word. I know that I'm a consultant, and you could say, like, well, I did this workshop, and she used the word lesbiterian. I use the word lesbiterian because I think it is funny. And that is how I identify as a lesbiterian. So, to use the platinum rule, we're going to talk about lesbian, but if you were to talk about me, you would say lesbiterian and hand me green olives. See, we're sharing. It's learning. So, if you look at the lesbian list, what is fascinating to me is that if you got somehow close to dismantling a binary system between heterosexual and gay, you screwed all that up by making it all binary when you got into the lesbian category. Because there's straight people and not straight people. And then inside not straight people, that's a different workshop, inside your columns of not straight people, there is gay and there is lesbian. So then now they're going to fit together all perfectly, right? So that the gay is feminine and lesbian is masculine. Okay, great. So these are the men, these are the women, these are feminine, these are masculine. These are the people who have promiscuous sex. These are the people who have lesbian bed death and instantaneously get on cell phone plans on their first date. It's a very long story. We make that binary fit back there, even though there are now 3 examples. Why do we do this? Largely because we're comfortable with it. What is fascinating to me about the lesbian list is I obviously can't even see your sheets of paper, but the limitations that come from the stereotype of lesbian, one, still keep straight men at the center because there's almost always a porn reference. So straight men are paying attention while you have dismantled, air quotes, this binary system between straight and not straight. So now you're in a bucket of not straight, and you have made it as binary as physically possible for the secret third party of this binary's like enjoyment. It is very important that you cannot have a safe zone or an ally or an advocate conversation until we understand how like rigid this binary need tends to be. Now, in the lesbian list, it is true that there is Team Cat and there is Team Dog. It is true that Subarus have some special place in our hearts. It's Martina Navratilovan's fault. All of those things are true. But it is also true that you can have stepchildren, you can be people of color, you can be of all different kinds of economic classes, you can have political involvement, you can have no political involvement, you can have all different kinds of religious expressions and all different kinds of jobs. All of those things could happen. But that's not what shows up in your list. And what shows up in your list is like you got one column away from the most privileged column, and then you got to the third column, so you had to like do a callback to it. Until we dismantle those pieces, we can't have a conversation about doing anything forward. Now, I got dangerously close to calling out white straight men for their privilege, but just for the record, white women, whether you identify as a lesbian or straight, there is a huge amount of privilege that exists in being white, upper class, educated, cisgender, and I would say if you don't identify as heterosexual, but you identify as a white, upper class, educated lesbian, you're pretty much getting the best tickets to the show. But until that gets dismantled, you got 2 other columns. My group of people, we got 2 other columns to bitch about at our brunch where we're like sharing quinoa recipes. So we don't ever acknowledge our own responsibility or anything that's happening to us. So it's not just men's jobs, and it is our responsibility to stop doing that, because that's also a binary around gender, but it's also a binary around power. And until you can begin to realize that I actually have the power to dismantle these systems at no cost to me from my dominant and privileged places, we're not doing any ally or advocate work. I am getting riled up, people. Okay, so now I want you to get all comparo. I want you to look at your gay and lesbian lists. Notice, draw circles, little smiley faces, stars, exclamation points, perhaps a frowny face. I don't care. Draw whatever you need to draw, but I want you to notice in your lists where that binary shows up, what themes show up, who's having sex, who's spreading disease, who's having children, who is spreading the word of some religious text. I want you to notice where those show up in gay and lesbian. You don't have to share them with anybody, but I just need you to notice, because if you, even in your most well-doing, being, well-thoughtful piece, are actually affirming the binary inside of a conversation that is not about the binary, then you're not actually having a conversation that allows people to talk about their own sexual identity, their own gender identity, expression, the perception of sexuality or gender, or the roles that they're playing in their relationship or in the world. So I'm going to take a sip of water, and I just want you to kind of notice what's showing up. I'm also going to check my text to see if any texts have come in. Oh, excellent. Great. Thank you. If you have anything, you're welcome to send a text message to the 202-670-4262 number. I'm happy to answer any kind of questions. It is also the case that y'all are at work, and so you may have questions that you can't ask on the chat, or you're nervous about asking at work, etc. That's what I'm for, so feel free to send me a text message. Okay, so if you have noticed that, now I want you to revisit the platinum rule. So if you have noticed where you kind of sink into this, and that could be SYNC or SINK, sinking into the kind of comfort of this binary, now I want you to think about what is it or who are you working with that maybe you've done that, so then you need to employ the platinum rule, start over. Here's what's really fun about being a jerk. You can be a jerk for a really long time and suddenly say, you know what, I'm being a jerk. And it's like an Instapot. It lets some of the steam off. I may not believe you. I'm going to be like, oh yeah, sure. I'm glad you're self-aware enough. Now I'm being a jerk. That's fine. It spreads. But when you let a little bit of that steam off, it opens the opportunity to have a new chance, a new relationship. So as soon as you realize you're a jerk and you tell somebody, oh, I've been a jerk, I'm going to try not to be a jerk. Now you have an accountability buddy, and you've asked for permission for feedback, which you may or may not actually be interested in getting, because at the root, you're a jerk. But that's how those relationships can get better, through the platinum rule. It is not about arriving at jerkless. None of us are jerkless. I am a total jerk. Ask my dog. But if I can't arrive at jerkless, can I become more aware of how I'm a jerk? And if I can become more conscious of what I'm unconscious of, then I might actually have better relationships with other people and their full self. That's really what we're shooting for. So, as we keep going through this, I want you to be thinking about the experiences of people that didn't fit into your little binary thing that you came up with on your columns. You may not have even known that that stuff was floating around in your head, but it is, not was, is. So then when you're engaging with someone and they don't affirm this totally inclusive except incredibly limiting binary that you have created for yourself, what are you doing to make a space for them and their full experience? Whether we are talking about a client or a coworker or a random person that is wearing a mask in the grocery store, what is fascinating is that we rarely provide the space for them. We write a story about them, and then they have to affirm this story or knock hard enough to get us to edit the story that we have written in the first place. There are people who are in your life right now who have much more complicated lived experiences and identities than you think. And they're just navigating the world with the knowledge that you do not actually know who they all are. I like to use the example of my uncle, who thinks he is a very funny person. That's actually false. He is not a funny person. We grew up in a very funny family, and I don't know where he was, but he does not. Nope. Mm-mm. So, growing up as a child, we would be all in the van, driving to a family excursion, and my very funny family would be like, all right, how are we going to laugh at Marcus's jokes? Because you know they're going to be there. And the payoff was we'd all get back in the van, we'd all laugh and be polite while we're there, and we'd all pile back in the van, drive back home, and we would deconstruct Marcus's failed attempted jokes. This is one of my favorite family memories. But we did it long enough that we eventually understood his sense of humor. It wasn't a good one, in my opinion, but I understood where his timing was coming from and how this was working and what's going on, and he eventually became sort of funny. He didn't have to change his sense of humor. I had to change my perception of his sense of humor. That is no different than any of the information I may share with you about my identity or my family or my relationships or my gender or my pizza toppings. Okay, now if you notice the heterosexual, gay, and lesbian columns, some of you already got comparo, but just notice if there was a binary that you somehow dismantled into a subcategory of a binary. Notice where you did that. Maybe some of you are advanced class and you're like, I did not do that. All right, well, you're about to screw up, so don't worry. It's coming. But just take a moment and notice kind of what you did in those three columns. Because as we shift to bisexual or transgender, what is very interesting is that because I have chosen these 5 words on purpose, and if we were in flip chart papers around the room, you would start at a different place and rotate around the room. But what is interesting to me is just the term bisexual and just the term transgender instantaneously starts you off in a non-binary place. Because people are like, what? I don't know what this means. So then you might even change person in how you are writing the comments. Instead of describing a community, you're describing your impression of the community. There's like a rotation of perspective. All of a sudden you get very specific or very big ideas. Whereas if you were to look at heterosexual, gay, and lesbian, you were really just describing a stereotype of a community. Usually these two don't even have the privilege of being a stereotyped community. They might be at most like a pamphlet stage of like, let me tell you about the word pansexual and omnisexual, because you have a better cable package than some people. You can get all like linguistically smart on people. We'll get into processes of like who can actually pass and who doesn't pass, who gets clocked and doesn't get clocked, what happens if you're gender nonconforming and you're not even interested in expressing yourself into a binary way. That's all about to happen. So hopefully your words are at least in a column. Sometimes they're in like a word cloud because you can't even do a list anymore. So I just want you to now we're going to pay attention only to the bisexual list. Put everything to the side and just pay attention because we never do. And by saying we, I mean gay, lesbian, and heterosexual people often invalidate bisexuality or fluidity or pansexual or omnisexual as a real identity because we are like, pick a team. Are you gay? Are you not gay? What's going on? So if we're doing that to people who are in our own community, how is this an ally program? What is happening? But that's what ends up happening. Even our like nicest ways of possibly being in the world. I'm Southern, so I grew up with a gift closet. I did not realize this is not a common experience for everyone, but a gift closet was full of like candles that were wrapped in towel sets just in case there were emergency deaths or births. You at least see one of those usually coming, but whatever. We had a gift closet. And the towels were his and her towel set. They're all wrapped up right for an engagement. So here's what's funny, is that a lot of Safe Zone programs take this his and her towel set and you buy 2 sets and then you split them apart. So you have a his, and a hers, and you wrap them up and you're so cute. You're totally prepared for everything. Then you meet a bisexual person and you're like, so which towel set do you need? I just need to update my inventory. That's about your pizza toppings and not their pizza toppings. It is also true that some people don't like towels and some people need more than 2 towels. But we're not ready for that, right? We just need to know so that I'm prepared for my gift closet. Are you getting a hers, or a his? Where are you leaning? What are you in the mood for this weekend? I want to be helpful and like set you up on a date. So who are we looking at? That is about us. That is not about them. What is fascinating to me is the limitations of what it means to identify as a bisexual or fluid person means you don't even have the privilege of being single. Because you can be a single straight, single gay, single lesbian person, and if you're a single bisexual person, you got to fit into a softball uniform over here. If you are in relationship with one person, then your identity is also invalidated because now you've chosen a softball team. That doesn't make any sense and is largely one of the most oppressive things that I think comes out of well-intended ally work is that we are trying to get fluid people to fit into two boxes who are trying to tell you, I don't like them boxes. So until that gets dismantled, we can't actually have a safer zone. So transgender is very similar. Most of the processes related to transitioning from one gender to the other, just notice the binary there, the processes themselves were actually created by people who do not identify as trans or gender nonconforming. And, thank you, racism, what ends up happening is a lot of the technology or science involved, like let's take hair electrolysis, for example. The laser shoots the dark thing because your hair is, of course, darker than your skin. But if that is not the case, because let's say you're not a white person, or maybe you have very fair hair, then it just burns your skin and doesn't actually do anything with the hair follicle. But for a very long time, using WPATH standards, facial electrolysis or testicular electrolysis was actually required in order to get any kind of surgical procedures, which you couldn't even do if you had a higher degree of melanin or keloid or something like that. Then the technology wasn't even available. And that's if you wanted it in the first place or had access to it. But we don't actually think about them. We think about us and getting these people from point A to point B as quickly as possible because I find it fascinating. That's not platinum rule. And what we need to be doing, and I want you to look at your list, is that when you look at the trans list, what ends up happening is like, oh, documentation, passports, bathrooms. How does that work? I don't know. That's about you, not about them. The bisexual list is like greedy or like just confused. Gay or lesbian people will often say that there's just a stepping stone towards picking a team, right? But when someone comes out as gender nonconforming, they have picked a team. It's their team, and they're trying to tell you what team they're on, and it's your job to accept whatever team they're on or to figure out what that means for you instead of smushing them into a category. So even when you're doing your lists, usually what will happen, even if you identify as a trans or gender nonconforming person, we will still default to a binary that is either based on sexual identity, gender identity, cisgender privilege, whiteness, upperclassness, educated, English speaking. For some reason, everyone is always in their 30s. That's just not true. But that's what shows up on the lists. So until we can understand the limitations, now scroll back and look at all 5. And when you scroll back here and look at all 5, all of those words, good, bad, ugly, or awesome, whether even if they were the wrong word and you put it in the wrong column, the directions were whatever comes to mind. So you nailed it. High five. You did a great job. But if those words are floating around in your experience and they're all kind of dangling from this binary that is very complicated because there's 2 options for all of those categories. Even Christian means Protestant or Catholic, right? Like everything has 2 options until you allow people to identify themselves, and then there's way more than 2 options. And we can intellectually understand that, but we don't always understand how that actually shows up with the people that we're working with. And more importantly, we often don't understand how that shows up in us. So I invite you to pay attention to what showed up. Now you have spewed the contents of your brain out on paper. Congratulations. Where do you show up in this? Do not panic. You're not doing role plays or having to share with anybody. I want you to have a conversation, though, of where does your sense of sexuality come from? Where does your sense of gender identity come from? Your sense of gender expression comes from where? When you decide what the meaning of certain gender roles are, where do those come from? And then how does that all get smunched together into how you perceive other people? And when you're perceiving other people, the binary we tend to default to is if it is real or accurate, or a phase or inaccurate. That's a lot of power to decide if someone else is real or not, or if they're accurate or not. But we can't have further conversation until that piece gets pulled out just a little bit. And I believe we can't do that until we pull out the language and the experiences that we have, space them out enough that we can then look down and notice the patterns of what happened when we pulled that apart. You get to pick and choose which of the patterns you want to keep, which ones you don't. I am not here to tell you what is right or wrong. You are welcome to ask me my opinion, but that doesn't mean it's right or wrong for you. The platinum rule is literally being fully conscious that it's going to take work. It's going to actually involve listening and asking questions. It is possible that Ned and I have been friends for a long time. We've gone out to lunch 100,000 times. We have that favorite little sandwich shop with the extra pickles. I love that place. And when I go out to lunch with Ned again, I'm going to ask, do you want to go to the sandwich shop or do you want to do something different? Because just because Ned and I always go for the extra pickle place doesn't mean that we're not going to go try that new pizza place. You ask questions because you engage in a conversation, and then you're actually open to receiving the answer to the question that you have asked. This is not fancy, but it's certainly skipped quite often when we're engaging in conversations. The goal of being an ally is to create and foster an environment where both the employee or the client and those served by the company or the organization can have the most successful interaction as possible. In my opinion, that's what that means. And if in a workplace, sometimes it's a little easier to articulate that, but take the last time you dialed a wrong phone number. There is a way of doing that that makes that an enjoyable experience for both people. There is a way of doing that that makes it a terrible experience for at least one of the people. That's, to me, the practice of real ally work, of doing real safe zone related work, is creating an opportunity that doesn't have to suck. Now, there's a lot, we were talking about this when we were kind of setting all this up, is that the term safe zone can be super problematic in a million different ways. And we have changed it to safer zone, right? Which fundamentally is saying, like, we know this is problematic, but we don't know what other words to say. But the truth is that we don't often spend enough time with each other to find out, are you actually going to listen to me if I actually share with you my truth? Like, we don't have time for that. Even in shelter in place, we don't take time for that. But we could. And that is too long of a title for a program, right? Is that we now kind of have time for it and we could take the time to do it, but we probably won't. But maybe this time, nope, just kidding, I don't want to. That's too long of a title. So I call this a safe zone training because it's more about dismantling the concept that you arrive into a safe zone and that you can then stay there and represent a safe zone forever. That's what I want to dismantle, because that is also a binary, that it is safe or unsafe. And the reality is that you are a zone, and that zone is impacting people consciously and unconsciously, whether you like it or not. And the safest element inside of your own zone is you. So if we can take responsibility for who and how we are, then we can figure out what we are comfortable with and not comfortable with about who we are, and become more conscious of what we are actually unconscious of. My kind of mantra is to do the best you can with what you got some of the time. So if we started this workshop off with like, let me tell you what heteronormativity is. Some of you are like, I already know this. I took the class. I wrote a book on it, right? But if we have a conversation about how heteronormativity, whiteness, able-bodiedness, Christianity, a two-party political system, how all of this stuff is just floating around in our heads, and then we're trying to like use throw pillows and curtains to make that place in our heads look different, that's not going to do anything. What we have to do is dismantle the binary system, do the best we can with what we got some of the time. And the first step of that is paying attention to who we are in the first place. It's important to know that whatever it is you come up with is not applied to every single person who uses one of the words at the top of the list. It is also important that you will meet someone that is like an avatar for every single thing you wrote on the list. And there's millions of people in between those two. That's what it means to actually listen and engage in a conversation about how and where do you exist and how may I be a part of that. We don't take the time to do that with everyone. And to be honest, I don't really know if we need to be doing that to everyone. That seems awfully vulnerable. But what if we just did that with some people occasionally? That would be better than never doing it ever. So if that's the case, then to be an ally, you have to leave some room for editing. So the story that I want to leave you with is the idea that we write stories about each other. We write stories because we need to feel safe and prepared. And in feeling safe and prepared, what that means is that I write a story based on my lived experience about who is on the other side of this phone, who I am about to talk to, and then I adjust based on the story that I have written with no input from that actual person as to how I'm going to show up and feel safe and prepared. Great. We need to take responsibility for that. I do that all the time. Then, and only then, do I take that story and set it to the side. Often we talk about cultural humility versus cultural competency. I don't want you to know every factoid about every person so that you feel competent. That is not a goal here. The goal is the cultural humility to recognize my lived experience is having this knee-jerk reaction. So I'm going to set that over here like a teddy bear because it makes me feel safe and prepared. Then I'm going to print that story out triple spaced with extra wide margins. And then I'm going to listen. I'm going to ask questions. I'm going to find out where Ned wants to go to lunch. And I'm going to make those edits into that story so then it's real and in the moment and current. I can take my experience or like some information that's coming at me and plinko it through my experience to make more sense of it or make suggestions, but I still have to come back to the conversation that's in front of me and actually listen. And by leaving room for edits, I invite the possibility of curiosity, authenticity, generosity, and vulnerability to exist in this exchange, even when we're here to tell each other that somebody dialed a wrong number. That's how you make that conversation good. You don't always have a willing participant on the other side, but there is a way of shifting that makes it that moment instead of the anticipated or expected moment. I write a story about this in my book, but I have a friend named Sylvie, and I texted her a very funny thing that happened at some point in time. But I accidentally texted it to my Aunt Sylvia's number instead of Sylvie's number. I imagine you could figure out how that happened. Sylvia, whatever, accident. Well, Sylvia, my favorite aunt I grew up with, died in a house fire about a decade ago. And I got a text back from Sylvia, which I will admit I was like, what is happening? And that is how I realized I texted the wrong person. But the person texted back and said, wow, that's a really funny story. I think you texted it to the wrong number. Now, they didn't have to do that. They don't know anything about my Aunt Sylvia. But in the moment when I saw Sylvia's name come up on my phone, I was so like, oh my God, what is happening? Because I didn't notice that I had done that until I realized she'd been dead for 10 years. And now she's texting me from beyond. What is happening? And then I was able to engage in this really lovely conversation. So I told this person, I have no idea who they are. And I was like, I'm very sorry for texting you, but I want to let you know you have the cell phone number of the most incredible woman that I have ever spent any time with. And it's just such an honor. You must know that you have a fantastic cell phone number. Who doesn't have time to hear that? Right? That's it. I never heard from them again. There's no like after school special ending of this. We didn't exchange photographs, or this person doesn't send me text messages on the anniversary of our meeting. But they took that moment to have a moment together that was real and about the two of us and what was happening in that moment. And it really meant a lot to me, even though I have no idea who that is. You know, like, we can make more of those moments. Most of the time we are waiting for someone to make those moments for us. Doing real ally work is about occasionally, every once in a while, trying to make a moment like that for someone else. So this is kind of the wrap of the first particular piece of the workshop. So this all gets to simmer and hang out with you for a bit. And we'll circle back, I think it's about a month later or so. And we're going to spend a much deeper dive then, specifically around sex, gender, and sexual orientation, meaning anatomy and biology, meaning gender identity, roles, and expression, and the perception of gender. And then sexual identity or sexual orientation, meaning these words we talked about today. Heterosexual, gay, lesbian, bisexual. Transgender is not a sexual identity, but they usually do get beaten up by the same people, so they get shoved into the group. So if we spend more time on those three elements as separate elements, we then can get into how sexism and heterosexism shows up, where that intersection occurs, and then we can move into, so evidently you filled out an ad to be an ally. What should you be doing? That's the third piece. So with that, I would invite you to feel free to text message 202-670-4262. You're welcome to use the chat. You're welcome to unmute yourself. I'll stop the recording so then we can have like a conversation with just us.